What's up, everybody? What's up, MGTOW? So I just wanted to do a quick video, which is partially a response video to English Dave's recent video, pair bonding, ? Is it a thing? So the topic of the video is going to be polygyny versus socially sanctioned promiscuity. So just to start off with, kind of addressing English Dave's points that he made in his video about social monogamy and socially enforced monogamy and sexual dimorphism and evolutionary psychology, where he was basically saying that, most animals are not monogamous in nature, and even the human species probably didn't start off specifically monogamous, which is all true as far as if you look at an evolutionary perspective. You look at it from a religious perspective, people might have a different point on that, but looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, yeah, humans are a tournament mating species, just like most of the other great apes, where there's kind of harems formed around alpha males and the secondary males don't get as much sexual access. Now, saying that, one thing to consider is the point of society itself, because when you're asking kind of monogamy or pair bonding, is it a thing? Well, then you have to ask society, is it a thing? Because society itself is a social construct, and therefore within the social construct is the social construct of monogamy, which is beneficial for society. Now, saying that, it's not beneficial for every individual male. And in fact, polygyny is technically more beneficial for the top males, and it's more beneficial in some senses genetically. For example, obviously, if the most productive people in society are truly at the top of society, then it would make sense genetically that if more of those people have offspring than people that are less productive, it would in turn make your society more productive in the future genetically. But of course, there's other social problems that come along with enforcing the 2080 rule by the state or through some type of enforced polygyny, because if you can't have wars of conquest where you send young horny guys out to basically take wives or take slaves from other cultures or other countries or somebody that's not you, then you start to have social unrest and things like that, higher levels of crime. But still, there are some other points to look at when you're looking at polygyny versus socially sanctioned promiscuity, because you could say that it's more beneficial to have polygyny in a sense, because at least the children that grow up in polygynous households will all have a father figure. They might have the guy might have a bunch of wives, but he'll be the father of all those children. He'll be responsible for all those children, especially if it's a state enforced polygyny, like say Islam or something like that. Then the father would be responsible for taking care of all the wives and the children. And so at least those people within the polygynous system would be getting the benefits of shared parenting and having a father figure within the family. But of course, then the trade-off is that there's going to be a large amount of men that don't have access to any women. Now, if you look at that versus socially sanctioned promiscuity typically looks something like, urban centers or, inner cities in the United States where there's a lot of people on welfare, a lot of women on welfare, and there's no father in the home. Because when women can be promiscuous and then they're socially protected and allowed to just jump around from guy to guy without actually having a father figure type guy in the picture, and they're receiving benefits from the government that basically doesn't really care what they do, then the outcomes for the children and then therefore society are going to be worse, because we already know all the statistics about fatherless homes and the outcomes that come from that. So you could see how one could argue for some form of polygyny as opposed to promiscuity, because promiscuity kind of implies that there's no strong bonds, no strong relationships. And now, of course, from a social perspective, for what's best for the majority of people in society, monogamy would be the best option. But then again, like I said before, when you're talking about society, society itself is a social construct. So of course, society is going to say that what's more beneficial for society is monogamy, because monogamy is more beneficial for society. Whereas an individual man, especially a man with a high level of resources, could argue that polygyny is better for the individual, namely the individual with a high amount of resources. So when you're looking at it versus the individualist versus collectivist kind of dichotomy, then if you're an individualist, polygyny should be supported in some senses, because it's the same thing as, having high paid CEOs at companies because they're just better than everybody else. Or, having any type of position where you have that 80-20 rule thing going on, where just a small percentage of the people are getting most of the stuff because they're quote unquote better than everybody else, and that's why they have it. So it is kind of hypocritical in a sense for a highly individualist person, and even you could say in the West, a highly individualist society, to not see the benefits of polygyny. And I mean, you could also argue that there is kind of a polygyny going on, because if a man has children with multiple women and they're all on child support and he's paying for their houses, I mean, there's really not that much of a difference, because like in African countries and some Arabic countries, you have to have a separate a separate house for each wife. So what's really the difference than a guy that's gotten divorced 4 times and is paying child support and alimony and paying for her house for 4 women, as opposed to the guy that's polygynous and has 4 wives and 4 separate houses? The only real difference is his parental rights. And so therefore, even especially within MGTOW, if it's better to have parental rights than not have parental rights, then in some senses, polygyny is better than promiscuity, because promiscuity seems to have the most negative kind of attributes out of any of the systems, because you got women running wild, sleeping with whoever they want, and the genetics is not always dictated by productivity in society, but sometimes it's triggered, their reproductive choices are triggered by physical attributes, and you could even say evolutionarily psychology attributes like muscles and a kind of aggressive attitude, which doesn't always equate to having the highest level of resources in this type of modern Western society. So you can see that there's just a lot of kind of problems with promiscuity. And then, of course, the outcomes with fatherless homes, or the trade-off is having the people that are in marriages in a polygynous society. There might be one guy that has 4 to 10 even wives, but he's still responsible for all of the offspring and all the wives. He's paying for them. It's not a burden on the state. It's not a burden on single men. But then the trade-off is that the men that don't have as much resources won't have any sexual access whatsoever. And so trying to kind of hedge your bets and balance in between polygyny, promiscuity, and monogamy, while on one hand it seems like, oh, well, if we just go in between these two things, it's better, but really it's not. Really, it seems like it's better to either have monogamy or have polygyny, and the promiscuity thing is like the worst thing that you can have, because for one, it doesn't really benefit individual men because they don't have control over their family, and in most cases, at least in Western society, they're still going to be responsible to pay for the family. And on top of that, you have the social negative that the outcomes for the fatherless children is going to be a detriment to society, statistically speaking. at least. So really, it's the worst. The promiscuity is the worst, even though that's most likely how we evolved in certain senses, because before, paternity testing and before patriarchy, women probably just slept around with a bunch of guys. Nobody really knew who the father was of the children, so they had to raise all the children basically equally because nobody really knew whose kids were who until patriarchy was introduced, and then men started mate guarding and all that type of stuff. So, I mean, to ask, is it a thing? It's definitely an interesting question, because then you have to look at, well, is society a thing? Because parts of society, parts of morals and ethics, and parts of how we run our society is based on physics. It's based on the environment. And parts of it are based on how people feel about the topics. And it seems like the people that make this emotional argument and try to put us somewhere in between polygyny and monogamy, and just have this letting girls gone wild type of society where women get to make bad choices and they still get paid for it, but men don't get control over their family and over their resources if they have sex with women, then it's kind of worse on both ends. Because at least, in the polygynous society, while there would be a large amount of men that wouldn't have access to sexual reproduction, the ones that do have access also have responsibility over their family, and then there'll be fathers in the home, and so at least a subsection of the society will be getting the benefits of growing up in a family unit. While monogamy obviously is the best for quote unquote society, which, we can talk about what society is and what society isn't all day probably. But in general, it's the best because it provides access to the most amount of men, sexual reproduction. Whereas, polygyny is best for individual men that happen to be successful, and promiscuity is just bad for everybody except for single moms and divorcees. So that's just kind of my take on it. I know it's not directly answering English Dave's question, but it's just kind of like a side issue. I guess you can even look at it as a kind of comparative study type of thing. So that's all I got for this one. Have a good day and go MGTOW.